Hey guys, welcome to the Max. As you can hear in the background, it is cattle moving day. So this allowed me to kind of talk about having cattle on a small acreage. For our farm is 36 acres, but about only 8 to 10 acres is actually pasture land, grazable pasture land. So today's video is really going to be focusing on raising cattle on small acreages and just giving some hints and hacks to hopefully help you if you're interested in doing cattle on your farm or on your homestead or just at your home and you just have 1 acre or 5 acres or 10 acres or even 20. What's the best way to keep that cattle? And that way they have a good life, successful life, but ultimately can provide for us either through dairy or beef. So that's today's video. You can see we're in this beautiful pasture. It's hot outside today in South Mississippi, but you can see just the gorgeous grass that we have. And I'll kind of scan you around. It's just beautiful quality grass. This is what we used to call the sheep field that's now kind of maneuvered to a cattle pasture. When we talk about cattle, you really need to decide what you're looking at raising. Is your goal to provide dairy, such as milk and butters and the asset of owning a dairy cow? Is your goal owning beef to provide beef for yourself, or you're looking just for extra money or a tax write-off, such as a cow-calf operation or a steer operation or raising your own bulls? So there's so many different facets of owning cattle. For us as a homestead, we're all the above. And what I mean by that is if we set our goal to be a little bit of everything, we do have family milk cows. We do have beef that we raise for steers, really for more our family, but can be sold. We do raise bulls, again, for our use, but also can be sold. And we do raise cow-calf operations to then turn around and sell the calves when we're trying to keep our herd at a minimum. You really need to have that goal wrote down and kind of have a plan, have a goal for your land to say, okay, if we're gonna manage this cattle operation, owning cattle has nothing to do with owning cattle. It really comes down to grazing land, having grass. You are a grass farmer by and large, even down to sheep. When we talk about sheep, almost the same way, it's just a little bit smaller. But we need to make sure our ruminant animals are taking in grass and not just some kind of feed. I get a question all the time, how much land do we actually need for cattle? When we talk about conventional raising head of cattle and beef herds, you tend to see people say, well, you need 1 acre or 2 acres per cow, per mama cow, per half acre per calf, 2 acres per bull. Meaning if you have 10 cows, 10 acres should suffice and be just enough, maybe not quite enough, so if it'd be good if you had 12 to 15 acres. So you're saying an acre per half of acreage. Now that's just saying if you're having 1 big pasture, maybe 2, maybe 1 cross fence, and you're able to kind of rotate them across that area. Now, let me kind of tell you the way we're doing it, very unconventional. And this is where you really get into kind of cow math to say, okay, we can possibly raise cattle when we don't have as much land. So here's an idea of what we're doing. It's just one of the fields that we're rotating in. Our goal is we break all our fields. We have about 10 to 12 acres of rotational grazing and pastures that we can utilize, as we talked before. We are opening up 5 more acres because we're trying to grow our herd, but ultimately we're not even using that acreage right now. That's the acreage right in front of the house. If you remember, we cut a lot of trees, and that is now going to become more usable acreage. But when we talk about grazing cattle and we talk about intense rotational grazing, a plan that I would say that a lot of people have come around to, especially in regenerative agriculture or organic lifestyle farming, or when you want your cows to be completely grass-fed, you have to have some kind of way of maneuvering. In nature, when cattle or buffalo went across the open range, they were eating and pretty much head down grazing at all times. And the only thing that really moved them was the fact that they had no grass behind them because they were eating them. Predators were coming and they were maneuvering that herd further away to where they just kept eating and grazing. Well, we do basically the same thing. We become the predators. So what I mean by that, and not actually predators, but we become the influence to move them. So when we talk about intense rotational grazing, we want to make sure they're where we want them to be. We are raising right now, we have about 20 or 25 head of cattle. Now only about 10 of them are here on the property. The rest are at our big farm that we raise some commercial cattle on. But our Herefords and our Jerseys are here. Y'all have seen other videos on them. We love our Jerseys, love our Herefords, so we want them close to us. So when we talk about raising our cattle, we need to understand what are we looking for in our cattle. Where we're looking for an organic version, a fully grass-fed steer to eat, grass-fed milk to drink, and also that we're giving them the best natural nutrients as possible. As we heal our land by letting them graze on it, but then ultimately feeding it back with the manure, but then allowing it to rest before we move them on there. Now, if I open this whole field up, this field is probably 3 acres itself. If I just said, we're just gonna open this field up and let them graze on this, they're not gonna eat every bit. They're gonna spread around and just pick and choose what they wanna eat. Well, that's not what we want. We want them eating in one area, so they intense graze it, they mob graze it, they put their fertilization in one concentrated location to then turn around and move within a day or 2 days or 3 days. So the size of your paddock, the size of your cattle helps you decide, okay, how fast or how slow do we need to move our animals? I have some paddocks that are bigger, but most of the time I try to antiquate, 3 or 4 cows and about a half acre. So if I've got, I'm gonna break this down into probably 5 parcels. So let's say this is 3 acres or 3.5 acres, I don't know exactly. We may say, a half an acre or a quarter of an acre for 7 cows and 2 babies to move in. Well, that's a lot of cows in one little area. So how fast can we move them, and why are we doing that? Kind of see where they have been. They're right here in this area, and they've been there for 2 days. We're gonna move them. They have not hurt the ground. There's still beautiful green grass there. Looks like you just mowed it or bush hogged it. You're not tearing the ground up. They're not putting too much manure down. If I left them there 3 more days though, guess what it's gonna do? It's gonna inhibit the grass from growing back. They're gonna eat way too much and chance eating and getting wormy because they're eating over their own urine and manure. So our goal is to make them eat that, but not be too invasive there. The thing about cattle, when you hear people say, well, cattle is bad for our earth, it puts too much carbon in the air. Well, if we raise cattle like they're supposed to be raised, you wouldn't have that problem. You would have fields like this and not dirt fields like stockyards where you raise them in CAFOs and then you're getting beef that's just been fed grain and they're literally in their own manure. Our cows, if you look at our cows, and I'll show them to you in just a second, there's not one bit of manure all over their feet. They don't have flies all over them. We spray them maybe once every 2 months because we don't need to spray a lot because we're heavily moving them on fresh grass every day or every other day, depending on the size of the paddock. So when we talk about cows and how much land they need, it's not necessarily saying they have to have 1 acre per cow, 2 acres per cow. It's all about the quality grass that you're growing and how many paddocks that you're making. If I put them on this land again, let's talk about this once more. They can graze this, and within 3 or 4 days, it would be pretty much kind of ate around. It may not look as good because some of that grass may not be as grown as this grass. Well, they may not like the palated taste of this older grass to this younger grass. You take all that out because when you become the predator, the natural inhibitor to say where we want them with netting or with rotational grazing fencing like Gallagher fencing or Premier One, we're saying we want them in this half acre eating this grass, fertilizing this area, and eating the immature ice cream grass that's so yummy to them, or the mature grass that they may not have the best palate for unless they have to eat it. So why do we do that? Because guess what? That allows this grass to grow maybe 2 more days. That allows this grass to grow maybe 4 or 5 more days. This allows this grass to grow maybe 6 or 7 more days, and so forth with the paddock over here, way back here, and so forth. What you're doing is you're allowing that land to rest as you prepare to move your cattle. Do we have to have 1 acre per cow? No. I think you need to be wise though and have more acreage when you're starting out to say, okay, if we have 5 acres, let's start off with 2 cow. That means they have tons of grass, and until we learn our rotational grazing plan, until we understand temporary fencing, until we get our cows used to fencing, until we do all these things to understand this cow, we may need to start off with a smaller herd and grow it. I think that's always wise. I never say go buy a herd that you're not aware of and they're not aware of your land and aware of rotational grazing, and then all of a sudden you try to, you know, teach them all this regenerative ag that they've never been used to, because conventional farming is bred in them where they stay in one field, eat some hay in the winter, eat some feed whenever they don't have hay, and eat this grass, and then get wormed every 6 months. If you try to take 6 or 7 cows on 6 or 7 acres, or 6 or 7 cows on 5 acres, and try to get them in some kind of rotational plan that they've never been used to fencing, they've never been used to movable fencing, they've never been used to just eating grass and no grains and no fertilized hay, you're going to cause some major issues with your cattle. If you're buying cattle from an organic farmer or regenerative farm, or they're already doing these practices, go ahead for it. You will pay heavy for it, but go ahead, because that, you know, they've been used to that. But like me, I didn't do that. I started off with 2 cows, and then I progressively either added 2, or we had calves and you know, grabbed on this baby, and then, you know, bartered this cow over from another farm. So it all becomes a way that you can learn your head and that they can get used to your plan. These cows, you see, they are literally standing here waiting to move, because they know it's their time to move. So, you know, Bohannon, he was our rental bull, and you know, we had to kind of train him to temporary fencing. At first, our whole goal was not to put him in temporary fencing, but he started following behind. Now, he was just one bull that we had to teach rotational grazing to. If all of a sudden we were trying to teach 5 cows or 5 bulls or 5 animals to rotational grazing, that would have got a lot harder. So what I'm saying is, don't bite off more than you can chew. Understand that when we talk about rotational grazing and you see all this beautiful grass, that they need to eat where you want them to eat, not where they want to eat. Now, if your cows are not used to not having fertilized grass, or your cows are not used to not having free choice GMO grains, or not having just hay accessible, or you're having to feed them daily, or you're buying them from a farm that is feeding them grain daily, it's going to be a major step. So be careful. You may have to ease them or lax them off some of those things. Now, we bought our cattle. Most of our cattle have been raised on farm now, but when we first started, they came from herds that were used to getting wormed, that were used to not moving, used to eating a lot of grain. So it really took us a year or 2 to kind of understand the cattle and train them to this new kind of way of life. We had to teach them what was the best way for us, and that they had to learn. Guess what we had to do though? We had to weed out a few cows over the last few years, because they just could not get this plan, because they were so used to conventional farms. If it be going through our fence and busting through, if it be used to medicine, because we were not giving medicine just all the time, as we were doing more preventative and proactive versus doing, let's just give them a shot because they always get a shot because they're eating off their own manure. If you're raising them on quality grass and you're not putting all this fake junk in their system, and you're not giving them GMO grains all the time, you're not gonna have sick animals. I promise you guys. I've said this in several videos before. Our cows, we've had cows for about 4 to 5 years here on this farm, and I've had about 3 or 4 out of all the ones we've had or have had that needed some kind of worming or some kind of medicine or some kind of issue that they were having. Some of those we culled, some of those we weeded out, some of those we treated once. But it was a process of getting our herd where we want them, and now we're to a point where we're not really doing any kind of treatment other than organic little soaps here and ACV here and some herbs here, and we've got a beautiful crop of herd here, a good crop of cattle that we're raising. You need to be making very small parcels for your cows. When people see that you're doing this, or when you're saying you're moving cows every day, people are gonna think you're nuts, especially if you're in a conventional farm area like us. We have all the time people say, you can't raise a cow without grain. You can't raise a cow moving them in temporary net fencing. You can't raise a cow with some kind of unfertilized hay because it'll kill them in the winter. Well, you know, we can. You can do it. But you have to find the right cow. You have to make sure your land is providing for them like you want it to. And you have to make sure that you're doing everything to make that cow happy. And what I mean by that is you can't let them overgraze this property. If they've been on here, no matter if it's rain, hail, sleet, or shine, and they need to be moved, you got to move them. And that's one thing, it's a very intense, when I say intense rotational grazing, it's intense on them, but intense on us too, because we're the ones having to make sure they're moved. We have to make sure they're moving to the next area to get that good quality grass, and that they're the fertilizing that they've already done and the grass they've already ate and mowed, that they're not going back over that and causing issues for their systems. Grass raises the cattle. You know, that's the main thing you need to remember. Grass raises the cattle. So when you become a good grass farmer, you become a great cattle farmer. Don't listen to the naysayers. You're gonna have a ton of naysayers when it comes to cattle, but just embrace the fact if you know what you're doing. There's been hundreds of years of history of cattle not using grains, not using fertilized hay or having fertilized grounds, but it was because they were rotating and they were having more of a natural movement on your grounds. Embrace that and understand that when you have naysayers come against you, or you have to treat a sick cow, or you have to cull a cow, or you have to sell a cow, ultimately you're doing the right thing, because you're making a cleaner, pretty herd for yourself, and you're also making your land better. We believe in it, and even when we have naysayers still to this day, I work with several guys who own cows, and they say the same thing. They're saying, look, your plan may not work. That wouldn't work with my farm. Well, yes, it would. You just have to embrace it. And if you just halfway embrace it, it's kind of like a diet. You're either all in or you're not. If you're working out but eating a nasty full calorie burger and honey buns at night, you're not going to lose weight. So you have to believe in what you're doing, believe in your diet, just like you have to believe in your grass formation, your rotational grazing, and understand your cattle. Don't let people discourage you. You can put your cows in anything as long as they learn it. I can hold cows in single wire fencing. I can hold cows in permanent 5-strand barbed wire. I can hold them in poultry net. It's all because they've learned that way. Now, if I get your cow, or if I go buy a cow at sale barn, I'm not gonna be able to keep them in that one little paddock unless they're a phenomenal cow. But ultimately, these cows have learned. They learned our ways. They've learned regenerative ag. They've learned our movement. They know the pattern. I could let them go right now, and I promise you they're gonna stand pretty close, because they know their next move is right here, not way on the other side of the farm. All this grass that's so beautiful right beside it is gonna even look better within 3 to 4 more days. And when you're doing paddocks and doing rotational grazing, your water source, make sure that you are providing water. Now in this area, we've ran water lines to where our well is providing water here. So pretty much anywhere we put it, we're at 100 foot from a hose coming into the property, to this back field. If you've got a pond or you've got a creek, like at our big farm, we've got a pond on one side, so our paddocks are built around the pond, to where basically at all times they're touching the pond, but it's at different locations. We have a creek on the other side, so at all times all those fields are touching the creek, and our paddocks are built solely around that. If you have a well right in the middle, then you need to make sure you're building a waterer right in the middle, and every paddock leads to that point. So you gotta think it out. You can't just say, well, I've got perimeter fencing, let's go buy some cattle and throw them in there. If we are rotating, what are we gonna do about water? What are we gonna do about shade? They need some kind of shade. We don't believe in big barns for them. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying, is there a nice big tree that they can kind of get under, especially after they graze and they want to lay down for a little bit and just chew their cud and kind of go get a drink and just relax. Remember, a cow gains its weight when it's laying down. Well, if you give them a shade, they're gonna lay under it. If you don't give them a shade, they may not lay down as much as you would want them to. So that's when a cow's gaining weight, and that's what you want the cows to make sure they are gaining weight. So we make sure that every place that we rotate them, there's some kind of shade, especially as the sunset hits and facing the east. We want to make sure they have a good coverage of shelter and shade. So water and shade are two big things when it comes to cattle. Other than grass, of course, is making sure you have those two things done. The elephant in the room is the fencing. Make sure you understand your fencing. Make sure your cattle understand your fencing. We train our cows to all kinds of fencing, but Premier One fencing or Gallagher fencing, any of these poly nets, to me, it's just foolproof. It's easy, especially even with calves or even with bulls that are stubborn. They can really learn to this versus learning to poly tape or poly wire, even though that's what we usually use. This is just a get by for this today in this paddock, but ultimately You need to train them, and there's other videos on that. We even talk about other videos on that. But if you're looking for a foolproof way and an easy way to move animals, this is probably the cheapest and most economical and easy kind of really rotational grazing for dummies. And that's kind of how we started. We had a few permanent paddocks, and we started using poultry nets because we already had them, and we had them for every other animal. That's what we still keep our sheep in to this day. And it really makes it easy. And so that's just things to think about. You know, fencing, water, shade. Make sure you have those game plans in place before you start picking up cattle and gonna go drop them off in a field, because you know they are big animals. They eat a lot and they need to drink a lot. I'm putting their charger up. Remember, whatever you're putting them in, make sure you have a good charger for using some kind of poly net or poly fencing. It's just so important. So we use the Premier 60 IntelliShock or 120 IntelliShock or Gallagher. There's 2 or 3 through the Gallaghers, and we have a link to Gallagher below. So we have a lot of things covered in this video. The main thing is you can do it. You can raise cattle on small acreages, but it all comes down to planning. Be smart in your planning. Look at things unconventional, and make sure you have goals set for you. These cows are on beautiful quality grass that, look, before they're even at this area right here, look at this. When that grass is tipped off, and we already got seed heads on the bahia. That's great, because ultimately they'll eat what they can. It'll be a little bit more mature, higher grass, give them more grass to eat. What they don't eat is already seeding, which will make for a better seed bank as they trample down into the ground with their manure. That is amazing. That is regenerative. That is raising cows on a small acreage, and you can do it. God bless. Happy homestead, y'all.